All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from a very white Israel, at least where I am, which is in the Jerusalem region. We've seen the first snow of the season. It's settling. The roads are closed. And I should apologize in advance if my internet connection gets a little bit spotty. This always happens, and it could be there'll be a power outage at any point. Unfortunately, that's what happens whenever there's a bit of snow. So hopefully, at least for the next half an hour, there won't be. On to the major issue of the week. Last week, we talked about the potential big bang of Israeli politics, the possible plea bargain by former Prime Minister and leader of the opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu. It emerged last week or the last couple of weeks that he'd been negotiating for some weeks, if not some months, over a plea deal on his three criminal cases, which are ongoing, even as the plea deal negotiations were going on. There was some optimism that a deal would be struck. It did appear that Mandelblit, the Attorney General, the person leading the discussions on behalf of the state, and Netanyahu's lawyers were coming to some sort of arrangement. There seemed to be some outstanding issues, but a certain amount of flexibility. But when the news broke, it appeared that some of the state prosecution teams and other people in the judicial system were outraged that there was a possible light sentence for Netanyahu being discussed, and there was suddenly a lot of pressure put on Mandelblit. First of all, it should be said that it's not a surprise that there's a lot of outrage in the judicial system. Don't forget, for the last few years, at least since the indictment was laid out and the court case started in earnest, or the investigation started in earnest, I should say, Netanyahu and his proxies would put out very disparaging messages against Mandelblit personally, the legal system in general. It got very personal. There were suggestions, which may well be true, that Netanyahu and his allies actually tried to do a lot of digging on anyone involved in the case, from the police to the justices to the state prosecution to the Attorney General. Don't forget the Attorney General Mandelblit, Mandelblit, is a former close ally of Netanyahu, to try and discredit phone conversations were relayed to reporters. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of people in the system who took this very personally, with far more outrage than would have otherwise. And possibly because of that, it actually rebounded on Netanyahu because of that hardening of the positions within the judicial system. It seems that a lot of pressure was put on Mandelblit to, at least, if he's not going to send if the deal is not going to involve jail time and some of the other things that seem to be relatively moderate positions on his case, then the least that can happen, the very least, is that the status of moral turpitude on any conviction, which would enforce a 7-year gap on former Prime Minister Netanyahu being able to be involved in politics. That's something, as we said last week, the Interior Ministry, former Interior Minister Aryeh Deri, had to go through. Interestingly, Aryeh Deri's plea bargain was confirmed this week. There was very little doubt in that, but it plays into the picture. As some speculate that Deri's relatively light sentence played into the feeling of the Netanyahu camp that he could get off relatively lightly. But what did happen is that there was a hardening on the part of the Mandelblit team, and they said that there is no possibility that this plea deal can come without that conviction of moral turpitude, which the Netanyahu team, at least some of them, did not want to countenance. There were some who did. There were some lawyers who said, still take it, it's a good deal. It ensures you do not go to jail. But what we did see is that basically time ran out. As we said last week, Mandelblit, his tenure ends on the 31st of January or the 1st of February. And then there's going to be an interim attorney general for about a month before they appoint a permanent attorney general. Mandelblit certainly showed interest in clearing the slate. There was talk that Mandelblit really wanted to try and clear the slate before he went into retirement, at least from this position. So it did seem that there was interest on both sides to get the deals done, but it's clear that they ran out of time, if there was even a closing of positions. And when that became obvious, former Prime Minister Netanyahu took to social media a 60-second clip basically saying there's been a lot of speculation in the media, most of it is untrue, I never accepted moral turpitude, there's a lot of other lies, and I'm going to continue leading the Likud and the national camp, the right-wing camp, for a long time. A lot of people looked into that and looked at what was said, and more importantly, what was not said. He didn't deny the negotiations were going on. He didn't deny that he was ready to plead guilty on at least 2 out of the 3 cases. And also, he didn't give a time frame. He didn't say, there is no negotiations, that's it, I'm back for good, and I'll see the court case to the end. He did not say that, so it's clear that the door has been left open. But what did happen is that really created, or at least tried to create, this picture of certainty within the Likud. If we talked last week about those who likely saw themselves as heirs to Bibi's crown, there were quite a few of the Likud members who already have thrown their hat in the ring. We're talking about everybody from Yuli Edelstein, Yisrael Katz, Nir Barkat, probably, well, undoubtedly the most popular out of the bunch, Miri Regev, Tzachi Hanegbi, Ami Ohana. And as soon as he put out that clip, we saw pretty much all of them except Edelstein retweet with a message, we support you, we're glad you're back. I mean, it went from, the really fawning messages of Miri Regev to, I always thought that you shouldn't go into these negotiations, you're the strongest we have, really fawning messages, to one by Nir Barkat, interestingly, and even Yisrael Katz, both of which have come under quite fierce attacks by Netanyahu's allies. So it's interesting that they were quite quick to say, we stand behind you, to fall in line. As I said, Edelstein was the outlier here, and his people basically said that the plea deal or no plea deal doesn't make any difference to our position. Yet Edelstein is the only one who openly stated that Netanyahu should anyway leave politics, or at least relinquish the leadership of the Likud to ensure that there would be the possibility of a right-wing religious government. Even if Edelstein would lose a lot of support for the Likud, they would still be able to put together a right-wing religious government. So Edelstein's position did not change. He still believes he is a contender, and he's calling for internal Likud primaries for the prime ministership before the end of the year. Everybody else, as I said, publicly at least, is now falling into line. Obviously, behind the scenes, things are very different. They understand, everybody understands in Israel, because we saw the pictures, we heard the discussions, that Netanyahu was prepared to negotiate. He was prepared to plead guilty. He was prepared to come to a deal. What that would have entailed, it's clear that the parties weren't ready for a deal. What is clear is that he probably won't get a better deal with the next Attorney General, even though we don't know the identity of that Attorney General. It will take the incoming Attorney General some months to get caught up with all the intricacies of the case. So what is clear is, even if there is a plea deal, it's not going to happen now for many months. As I said, probably well into the late spring, early summer at the earliest. But what is being speculated is that the window may well have closed, because whoever comes in will not be as powerful as Mandelblit, will not have that sort of personal background with Netanyahu. And there is a lot of ill feeling and bad will within the judicial system because of the personal attacks, because of the investigations that took place, the phone tapping, some of the accusations have been against some of the people involved. So it's become very personal. And when they found out that this plea deal potentially would be too soft in their eyes, they came down very hard. So they're going to be very prepared. Whoever comes in next as the Attorney General, they will make sure that the message is relayed that we're okay with negotiating a plea deal, but it can't be anything without, at the very least, his conviction on moral turpitude, which would almost certainly spell the end of Netanyahu's political career, which is why he's fighting it tooth and nail. But it remains to be seen how far he'll go. Will he give up on politics to save himself from going to jail? Let's not forget there are other examples of some senior people in Israel who were prepared not to strike a plea deal, and it ended up going much worse for them. We're thinking most obviously of former President Moshe Katsav, who was indicted and in the end convicted of rape. At one point, there were discussions that he could get off on some lesser crimes. I can't remember exactly, sexual harassment and others, and even not see the inside of a prison. He decided not to go to the plea deal, believing that he could get off. And in the end, he was convicted of rape and served time in prison. So there's a precedent there for those who believe that they'll get off in the end. The fact that Netanyahu is prepared to enter into negotiations lends itself to the belief that probably he understands that the judicial system is against him. He probably has also seen what's going on in court. Some of the high-profile witnesses on behalf of the prosecution have already started giving evidence. There's Shlomo Filber, who's coming up next in the coming weeks, and it's the prosecution's intention to show he will be the one that sort of closes the gaps in the prosecution's case. They've made a case that, yes, the Netanyahu family were involved in sort of coverage, and others who say, yes, some of the regulation was stopped, was suspended, and all these other key elements in the prosecution's case against Netanyahu. But Shlomo Filber apparently is the one that the prosecution feel could come in and really close all those gaps and put, join the dots together. So there is a feeling that the next few weeks could be uncomfortable for Netanyahu. Maybe that will give him another impetus to try and seek a plea deal or not. Remains to be seen. As I said, the likelihood is there's no plea deal in the immediate future. So what that basically means is the so-called Big Bang of Israeli politics has been put on the back burner, and all the sort of knives within the Likud, apart from Edelstein's, have been sheathed from now. But it certainly will not be the end of it. It's clear that this whole episode has weakened Netanyahu's position, his standing in the Likud, even if it hasn't necessarily weakened his standing in the eyes of the public. People in the Likud know that he was prepared to accept a guilty plea on many of the accusations, and he was prepared to leave at least for a certain time. Exactly how much time he was prepared to leave politics remains to be seen, but it would have weakened him, certainly, and it's unclear exactly how much and how long he's going to stay at the helm, and whether he's going to try and get into immediate negotiations with the next Attorney General. So it's clear that, while there is a lot of fawning from the major figures who came out and said that they want to inherit the Likud crown, behind the scenes they'll have seen chinks in Netanyahu's armor, and it certainly will play in very much to how they move ahead. And that's and we'll get a bit of a sense of that in the weeks and months ahead. The weather in Israel is the other big story of the week. I've always said that Israelis can stand war, can stand conflict, can stand rocket attacks, can stand terrorist attacks. But when it gets to a bit of inclement weather, they don't really know what to do with themselves. So for days we've been hearing about the storm. It's now on us. So that's really the other big news story of the week. But if there's anything else on your mind, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have is there any sort of other stigma aside from not being able to serve in politics for 7 years that the moral turpitude comes with that Netanyahu would be willing to risk an indictment and possible prison time instead of having that as a plea bargain?
It's not really a stigma. It's a legal status. If he is convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, legally, he cannot hold any position for 7 years. That's it. It's a legal situation. As we said, we saw with Ari Deri, he had to leave politics. But like Ari Deri is much younger, but Ari Deri returned to politics, and his party, definitely Shas lost all of its power while he was away, but certainly in the last few years, it's regained a certain amount of power. His supporters believe that he's innocent, that he's a victim of some sort of conspiracy. And it's very similar to how the Likud feel about Netanyahu. So I think that, would it have been possible for Netanyahu to return if he was much younger? Undoubtedly. Don't forget, he did take time out of politics when he was beaten by Ehud Barak in the late 90s, but he came back and he's led the Likud since 2005. So if he was a younger man, certainly I wouldn't bet against him returning, but he's already in his 70s, and I can't remember the exact age, but I'm pretty sure he would be in his 80s by the time he would be allowed back into politics. And again, we've had older people in politics, whether it's Ariel Sharon or Shimon Peres, but it's a long time. And that he wouldn't sit around and wait for him. There would be other people who would come in, probably, very possibly, even a new prime minister from the Likud. And it would probably be very hard, or much harder, for Netanyahu to return. So there's nothing else really that comes with it. It's a legal status, and the most obvious part of it is the fact that he would have to leave public office for 7 years.
Understood. Thank you for clearing that up. Eric Selkov asks, since the current government dislikes Netanyahu, why don't they pass a law restricting the number of years a prime minister can serve, or something like that? Something else that would make it impossible for Netanyahu to return to power. Sorry. Is it because that would possibly end the current coalition government?
No, actually, this is something which is being discussed by this government and probably will pass at some point, unless there's political factors involved. There is talk of passing a law, and I think it's even gone through the Government Committee on Legislation, possibly. At least there's been support from almost all of the ministers in the government, maybe Shaked, maybe not. But basically, it would limit a prime minister from serving 2 terms or 8 years, depending which came first. But it wouldn't be retroactive. So even if it was passed tomorrow, Netanyahu's clock, or if he would ever get back into prime minister's office, would only start from day 1 of the next time. There's no talk of any retroactive clause to that, and in fact, I think it would be shot down from the Supreme Court if there was. There is talk of another law which anyone who is under indictment at all, a criminal indictment, cannot serve as prime minister at the moment. If you're under indictment, you cannot serve as minister. But there's a sort of loophole that says that that doesn't apply to prime minister. That's what Netanyahu argued all this time. But there is talk of tightening that up. But there's less support for that. Certainly Ayelet Shaked is against that. And I believe that she is the head of the Government Committee on Legislation. That's not to say it's not possible to pass it, but there's certainly less enthusiasm for that. But as far as term limits, there is enthusiasm, but it wouldn't be retroactive.
Understood. Ada Tiber asked, to my mind, nobody comes close to the abilities and intelligence of Netanyahu. What do you think the Likud would be without him?
Well, I mean, there's a debate. there are those who say that, yes, Netanyahu is a genius. He's the greatest prime minister there's ever been in the state of Israel. And there's others that say that, the PR was more than the actual policies. The country stagnated in many levels. We were able to pass a budget. Everything sort of went along with what was good for one person. That's the argument for term limits, because they say, after a certain amount of time, a leader convinces themselves that what is good for themselves is for the country, what's good for them is good for the country, and not necessarily the opposite. So was he a great speaker? Undoubtedly. Was he great at communications, strategic communications, even social media, and all the rest of it? Absolutely. There's no one who comes close. There's someone who works in political communications. There's no one who comes close to him. But on policies and issues and moving the country forward on many different areas, certainly there's great disagreement on that.
Thank you. Stuart Broad asks, with a possible departure of former Prime Minister Netanyahu from an active political role, how will that affect the stability of the unlikely coalition government under the current Prime Minister Bennett?
Well, when there was a feeling that the plea deal could actually happen, there were a lot of implicit, some even explicit messages that could change everything. That could change the whole mathematics. Don't forget, there's at least 3 right-wing parties in the coalition. You have Yamina, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's party. You have Gideon Saar, Justice Minister Gideon Saar's New Hope party, and you have Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party. Now, Yisrael Beitenu, out of the 3 of them, is the least likely to sort of go across the aisle, because they have also said that they're not likely to sit with the ultra-Orthodox parties because of their agenda. The other 2 have less of a problem with that. We found, especially in New Hope, some people saying that this could, change the mathematics. Interestingly enough, there was a lot of talk that if Netanyahu does leave, whether Gideon Saar would go back to the Likud. As we know, he left the Likud, and pretty much everyone in his party came from the Likud or came from Netanyahu's camp at one point or another. But he came out at a party meeting this week and said that he has no intention of returning to the Likud. There was some quotes who said he would never return to the Likud, but I'm not so sure if that's true. And I highly doubt that it would be so unequivocal. But certainly, if Netanyahu were to leave for whatever reason tomorrow, it would put a lot of pressure on this government. It would give the right wing much more power, because they would have leverage, because they would have more than one possibility. They would have an opportunity to leave at any one point, and that would put them in a very strong position. But at the moment, as I said, that's been put on the back burner. We saw a nice picture today of all the leaders of the parties, or at least the parliamentary leaders of the parties, having dinner together, all smiles. They took a camera, went to social media, went to the mainstream media. So they're trying to put on a good face. And certainly the fact that the plea deal is off the table for now means that it can go back to business as usual for now, and certainly for the next few months. But if Netanyahu were to leave, certainly that would change the whole dynamics, and it would make it far less likely that the deal between Bennett and Lapid, where Lapid would become prime minister, would actually come to fruition.
Understood. Thank you. Jeffrey Shaft, switching gears a little bit here. He asks, why are the illegal Palestinian settlements in the West Bank being allowed by the Knesset to be electrified?
Well, this is part of, it's not really to do with the Palestinian towns, it's more to do with in Israel, where there's a lot of Arab towns which are not considered, don't have a legal status, and they're not connected to the electric grid and water resources, etc., etc. So one of the things that's very important for the Ram Party, which is an important part of the government, was to pass this law, which is called the electricity law, that would link up not just Arab towns, but there's some Jewish Israeli majority towns as well. And even there was talk of quid pro quo in ensuring that Jewish Israeli settlements over the Green Line that are not recognized would also then receive electricity and water. But it's a very important issue for Iran. A lot of their constituents, especially in the Negev, where it's really their base, are not recognized villages, not recognized towns, hamlets, whatever you want to call it. And this law is very, very important for them. There was a lot of negotiations around this, as you can imagine, a lot of compromises. But in the end, some sort of law will be passed in the coming weeks that will connect at least a large amount of these unrecognized towns and villages to the electricity grid.
Thank you. And an anonymous attendee asks, is moving Connemara the first step by Gantz and Lapid to giving up the large part of Judea and Samaria?
Absolutely not. No, this is an issue that's been on the agenda for a long, long time. It was, under right-wing governments, under Netanyahu, nothing was done. The Supreme Court kept on demanding that the government act because the Supreme Court had said that you can and should demolish Khan al-Ahmar because it's illegal, it's illegally created. Interesting, we hear a lot of on the right that say, the Supreme Court and the judicial system acts against us, it's got a left-wing agenda, and we're trying to push a right-wing agenda. Well, Khan al-Ahmar is an example of the opposite. It's true. The Supreme Court has said you can and should demolish Khan al-Ahmar, and successive right-wing governments didn't do anything about it. So this government was given an ultimatum by the Supreme Court. This is the last time we're going to give you, stay to deal with this, and basically have said that this is the last time you have to deal with it. What now appears to have been agreed is that they'll move it 300 meters away from its current position. Again, it is a very sensitive issue. It's sensitive domestically, and it's extremely sensitive internationally. It's a headache which everybody from the extreme right to the extreme left wish would go away. It seems that there may be a compromise now happening, but it's not part of a wider policy. No large swathes of Judea and Samaria will be given up in this government. As I've said before, because of the nature of this government, because it's right-wing and left-wing and centrist, and even as an Islamist party, there's no way that they can agree on any major diplomatic steps moving forward. So basically, it won't happen at this point. There will be no great unilateral steps or even bilateral steps with the Palestinians under this government. So no, I don't think it's indicative of anything. It's a long-standing issue which has been ignored by whoever was in power, and finally it had to be dealt with. So they tried to find a way to sweep it under the rug without having to deal with it too much.
Neil Sussman asks, Iran has unmanned drones which can carry bombs to Israel. Does that change Israel's calculations?
Not necessarily, because it's, the Iranian military threat has been there for a while, potential nuclear element, how it would attack Israel if it would, there's plenty of ways. What has happened this week is, with the Houthi from Yemen, Iran's proxy there, attacking the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not necessarily new, but attacking UAE, attacking Abu Dhabi, shutting down the airport as a result of these attacks, that really has changed the dynamics in the region. And there is a feeling that it's not impossible that the Houthis could directly attack Israel. They certainly have the capability with drones, with missiles. They've been given very highly sophisticated weaponry from Iran. And the beauty of it from Iran's point of view is they can attack Israel, and they can attack UAE, some of its other enemies, without necessarily them pressing the button, although everybody in the region knows exactly who's behind it. So it's a very dangerous game Iran is playing. And it does certainly see that, what people call the Hezbollah effect. Hezbollah have all these rockets across the border pointed at Israel. Now we see in Yemen, there are multiple very serious and very sophisticated rocket systems which are aimed at some of the more pragmatic Sunni states, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So certainly at the moment, what's been happening the last couple of weeks has certainly been changing the game. Perhaps it's bringing Israel closer to some of the Sunni nations because now they have this threat, the very real threat. It's no longer sort of threats. It's action. They have launched attacks against the UAE, and the UAE have responded, and Saudi Arabia have responded. So the region is absolutely closer to a conflict than it's been in a while. Certainly that particular the Gulf area.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this week. And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar on NYC Mayor Eric Adams and the Islamists with Daniel Greenfield. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.